Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, and Ruminations. And the topic of this discussion will be to what extent the similarities we see today with our current political crisis and system is analogous to that of the Roman Republic. So a sort of TLDR version is the Roman Republic was based on an enfranchised yeoman base from where they conscripted the legions. But in the century of conquest of the Mediterranean from around 200 to 100 BC, there was increasing stresses on that class, and their property was eventually sold off to the patricians. So you had the means by which the Republic operated was fundamentally compromised. And most of the skills these people had were military in nature. And so eventually the political process broke down and legions marched on Rome. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar. And eventually, we saw the complete facade of the Republic in this last century. And to what extent can we look at the last 4 years in the United States and say, are we in an analogous position to the Roman Republic? In his appearance on the Bill Maher show, Steve Bannon said that millennials and Zoomers in particular are like Russian serfs. They don't own any property, or any influence at all. And so in that respect, we have a large disenfranchised class. Now, these aren't soldiers, and no one's marching on Washington, D.C., but what we do see, though, is that the real power behind the American system, financial power, the oligarchs are now running in elections. Bloomberg paid, to quote Steve Bannon, engaged in a leveraged buyout of the Democratic Party so that he could essentially bend and break the rules to get into the debate stage. We also saw Tom Steyer. Now, obviously someone on the left might say, well, Donald Trump ran first. True, but Hillary Clinton outspent him 2-1. So Donald Trump wasn't running as an oligarch for the oligarchs, though he might have come from that class. Really, Bloomberg and Steyer are. And this is actually another element of I think, interesting overlap. So when the land reform crisis in the late Roman Republic came to a head, the Gracchi brothers took the populist stance to redistribute the land. And they were sort of like themselves from upper classes. So they were sort of seen as a traitor to the patrician class. And in a lot of ways, you could see that Trump is a kind of Gracchi in the sense that he's a populist, he's taking a more populist stance, and he comes from that class. So, I guess I'll hand it to Keith first. But so are we in a position analogous to the late Roman Republic?
Well, I think in some ways we can draw analogies between the Roman Republic and now, but there are also problems with an analogy like that. One of them is the time frame. If we look at the history of Rome, we see that Rome, on one hand, passed through a series of phases that are similar to what the United States has faced, in the sense that Rome started off as a monarchy, then it became a republic, and then it became an imperial empire. However, it did, and the United States, I suppose we could say, started off as part of the British system, so under the British monarchy, and then became a republic. And I would argue we are certainly an empire now, and that the American president is, a monarch or a Caesar or something in all but name. We've long since done away with the idea of representative democracy, or whatever you want to call it. We have an executive run state at this point. But at the same time, the period of time hasn't been nearly as long. I suppose you could say what has happened in the United States is a more rapid unfolding of what happened to Rome. And we could say, well, maybe there are reasons why that was accelerated. For example, technology and levels of economic development and communications technology and things like that. A case could be made for that. But I also think there are important differences between the United States and Rome. I think a much better analogy is to look at traditional societies on a more general level and compare them to what we think of as modern, bourgeois type societies. The historic norm in traditional societies was that you always had an oligarchy. You always had the elite of the very rich at the top, and along with the political rulers, the royal dynasties or Caesars or pharaohs or whatever. And then you had the masses of common people, most of whom were very poor. Yeah, you had a middle class of artisans and scribes and merchants and stuff like that, and people holding various privileged positions. But for the most part, a traditional society is one where you have the elite of the rich at the top and the masses of poor people, and not much else. And that is what a normal historic society looks like. Now, what those of us that live in modern Western civilization are more accustomed to is first of all, a post-scarcity society where getting food and shelter and basic things that you need, at least until recently, haven't been that much of a problem for most people for a few generations at least, and which have for quite some time been very middle-class oriented societies. If you look at the modern West, probably one of its big achievements, well, definitely one of its biggest achievements was a very large middle class that was really unprecedented historically, where even people that are technically working class could have a more or less middle class, even upper middle class standard of living. Now, we've started to see that reverse in recent decades. I think in the United States it's particularly pronounced. We can debate why this is, but in the United States we're starting to see a situation where the divisions between rich and poor are more like what they were back in the early 20th century, before the rise of the modern American middle class, and increasingly like what you find in traditional societies. If you look at Latin America, for example, I think Latin America is really a good analogy. In Latin America, you have always had, ever since the first European colonists came, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and so forth, you've always had a system of oligarchs at the top, the very rich. You've always had the masses of peasants and poor people. And in Latin American politics, you see plenty of Caesarism and demagoguery. If you look at the whole legacy of Latin American politics from, say, the 20th century, you see a lot of military dictatorships and stuff like that. But even within the context of parliamentary systems, you see plenty of demagogues and strongmen, and left and right. Pinochet and Perón and Chavez and Castro and plenty of other people like that. Now, in the United States, I think that we're beginning to resemble not so much ancient Rome as much as, we may be in some ways, but I think more closely we resemble Latin America now increasingly, in the sense that we have increasingly the same massive divide between rich and poor, a shrinking middle, and then we are starting to see the same kind of political divisions. If you see the political divisions in Latin America, they tend to be between neoliberals on one hand and social democrats on the other. That's their mainstream political alignments. And then you also have demagogues and populists and left and right who claim that they're going to save the people from this, that, or the other thing. Whether it's Bolsonaro or Chavez or Maduro or Castro or Cristina Kirchner or Morales or somebody like that. And then you also have on the margins in Latin America, you've always had, and sometimes not so much on the margins, you've always had extremists from the left and right who engage in actual terrorism and that kind of stuff. And we're seeing prototypes for that in North America as well, with these Antifa people from the far left and neo-Nazis from the far right and stuff like that. So I see America becoming more like Latin America and less like the Roman Empire in its latter phases. Because for one thing about the Roman Empire is that when Rome made the transition from a republic to an empire, that was really only the beginning of the Roman Empire and its, and in all of its glory. Whether you like the Roman Empire is a different thing, but the great mighty Roman Empire actually became even mightier during the post Julius Caesar period, post Augustus Caesar period. It was in those last few centuries of the Roman Empire, before the decline started in the last couple of centuries, that the empire was really at its peak. right now, I don't really see America's empire on the verge of reaching its peak. I see the American empire starting to constrict. I think the American empire probably peaked sometime in the late 20th century, maybe early 20th century, maybe the post-Cold War period. Around 2000, something like that, is when the American empire peaked, and we started to see the American empire starting to, if not retreat, at least a lot more and more holes in the empire starting to be exposed, and more flat tires and things like that. So I see the American empire in a place of retreat now, not something that's expanding or is going to continue to expand or hasn't yet reached its peak. So I think that's another problem with the Roman analogy, is the trajectory of the empire, in addition to some of the issues with the domestic situation as far as class and politics and all of that.
Okay, Swithun, do you think that we're in an analogous position to the late Roman Republic? Okay, we can't hear you, Swithun. You might need to affect your sound here. We can't hear you. So I'll ask the question to Ruminations, and hopefully you can fix it by the time it's back to you.
I do not think that the current situation is one that has a good analogy with the fall of the Roman Republic and its replacement by the Roman Empire. One of the reasons that I don't buy the analogy is that, as Keith pointed out, it seems like the American empire, which already exists, is in a situation that may actually have a better analogy in the fall of the Roman Empire rather than in the rise of the Roman Empire. I would point to the analogy of maybe the fall of Athens, because it started to fall as an empire while it was still, at least nominally, a democracy. I think that it's a mistaken idea that in order for an empire to rise and then decline and eventually fall, that it has to go through a period of explicit dictatorialism. That didn't happen in Athens, and it was actually the fall of Athens that led to the rise of an explicitly oligarchic state in that case. And I don't really see the United States ever going in any kind of nominally anti-democratic direction, because the rhetoric of democracy and the fixtures of an at least externally democratic system have been so ingrained in the American psyche that I don't think that you would ever find an actual formal institution of an American, say, monarchy or oligarchy that would predate any fall of the American empire. In other words, I think that democracies are just as capable of being empires as dictatorships are, or at least explicit dictatorships are. And in that sense, rather than awaiting a kind of rise or fall of the American Republic and rise of an American dictatorship, I think that really more accurately, we've already passed into the phase of the decline, or at least things anticipating the decline of the American empire. So a better analogy might actually be the end of the Roman Empire rather than its beginning. If you look at, well, for example, the way people talk about political correctness looks a lot like the way Edward Gibbon talked about Christianity. If you look at things like inflammatory monetary policies, or the prospect of mass migration and so forth, it looks like there's a real analogy between what's going on in America and the fall of the Athenian Empire in the face of what might be seen as Spartan barbarians, and the fall of the Roman Empire in the face of Gothic and other barbarians. To think that we would need to go through an explicitly dictatorial phase to enter into the passage of decline, I think is a distraction from the actual thing that America is undergoing, which is not the rise of an empire, but the fall of a pre-existing empire. And so I think that it would help to shift the comparison of analogy away from the fall of the Roman Republic to the fall of the Roman Empire, and maybe even more aptly, the fall of the Athenian Empire. Those are some of my thoughts.
Okay, Swithun, we'll hang out
Hello,
to.
hello. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we're good now.
Excellent. So what I was going to say was, with a dictatorship and sort of Caesarism, as you had in the late sort of Roman Republic, I think is unlikely, and I think the coronavirus is actually an interesting example of this. I don't see any evidence of any sort of traditional strongman dictatorship running the show in America or in Britain, for one thing. I mean, what is clear is we have a technocratic elite. I mean, it would seem that Trump seemed to not want to do anything about coronavirus, rightly or wrongly. He wanted to do it himself, but all the sort of elite, sort of quote unquote elite scientists, and all of those associated with the sort of establishment, federal government agencies, etc., were all very much like, oh no, we have to follow the science, and the whole sort of response has been very much sort of a expert, quote unquote, led response, which is, and they seem to have usurped what the sort of tendencies would have been of sort of what you might think of quasi or proto sort of Caesarist figures in sort of Trump and Johnson, because from my understanding as well, Johnson didn't really want to do very much at all. He was originally trying to go with the herd immunity strategy, but then sort of succumbed to the bureaucracy, as it were. Now, interestingly with that, though, is the bureaucracy seems to be much more authoritarian than the tendencies of Trump or Johnson would be, which is an interesting situation. You haven't got, so Trump and Johnson aren't really, in a sense, the strong arm authoritarian leaders that they may be perceived to be, but rather what you have is a very sort of modern phenomenon of sort of an authoritarian technocratic elite. And in a sense, you could say that the oligarchs in sort of Bloomberg, in a sense, are sort of classic sort of technocrats, sort of at least sort of expert financiers, as it were, who are sort of trying to associate with engineering the economy using the Federal Reserve and other sort of monetary and fiscal policy just to fine tune the economy as such. So the sort of a classic sort of Caesarism, I don't really see coming, at least in America or in Britain, anytime soon. That said, they're certainly being softened up for much more authoritarian policies. I mean, the current coronavirus one is a clear example of that. And also, you now have in Britain the police setting up hotlines so people can snitch on their neighbors for going out at inappropriate times. Because we're only supposed to leave the house for essential purposes, and the police are encouraging people to ring them up to say that whether they're breaking the law, as it were. So we have a rising authoritarianism, but it's certainly of a different type. And I say the strongman leaders who sort of Trump and Johnson seem to be proto versions of, don't seem to have been able to pull much power, at least not directly in this current situation.
Okay, I think the interesting point that we can talk about is how, especially with the Democratic primaries, even though Steyer and Bloomberg are out, does the fact that the oligarchs have sort of not just run through proxies, but run as candidates themselves in an election, are we going to see more of that, or was this just a flash in the pan? I'll get that to you, Keith.
Well, I think it's quite likely that we will see more billionaires and people like that running for offices in the future, simply because that's how the system, at least in America, works, where if you want to run for an office, certainly something like the presidency, you have to have lots of money. And these happen to be the people who have lots of money. And then they also have the means through which they can simply step into the system and kind of buy their way into the electoral process without having to go through the process of raising money from PACs and lobbyists and all the usual sources that that politicians get their money from. So they can sort of bypass the whole fundraising process up to some degree. So I think that the American system at present is simply set up in a way that it encourages that. It encourages people that already have billions of dollars to run for offices. And, I think that also feeds into the vanity of a lot of these people. A lot of these people look around and say, okay, well, what's the one thing I don't have? Oh, yeah, the presidency. So, obviously that, ego and individual ambition and stuff like that are going to fit into that. As to whether that's something that's particularly important or not, I'm not so sure. Because I don't know that it ultimately matters whether you have individual billionaires running for offices and winning, or whether you have some, professional politicians who are funded by PACs and lobbyists that are controlled by billionaires running and winning. I mean, it's whether it's a front man or a woman for a billionaire or an actual billionaire, it just seems to be a somewhat technical distinction. People talk, for example, about, well, Donald Trump bought his way into the system, or he bought the presidency. Well, if you look at the Republicans, who exactly is Sheldon Adelson? Or on the Democratic side, look how many billionaire financiers are behind the Democrats, George Soros and others. So I think that the real issue with that is that it shows the degree to which the United States is a plutocratic oligarchy. And I think that, once again, that gets back to my analogy to Latin America. In Latin America and in many traditional societies and underdeveloped societies or developing societies, that's what you find. That's just how it works. You have the oligarchs, they have their front parties, or they simply run the state themselves. And then you have the masses of poor people, and then you have the demagogues who come along promising to assist the people in some particular way. And that's how traditional societies work, democracies and republics and oligarchies alike. And I think more and more that's what we're heading towards. I think the real important thing about the American system right now is the way that this kind of post-scarcity, large middle class oriented bourgeois post-war, mid to late 20th century model, how that is fading away. In fact, one of the best books I know of about this is this one right here. For people who haven't read this, I'd certainly recommend it. It's Leviathan and Its Enemies by Sam Francis. Sam Francis was a paleoconservative who argued that, and this is back to what was being said about this managerial class, this technocratic class. He argued, following James Burnham's argument, that in the 40s, in the mid 20th century, the old traditional bourgeois class, capitalist class, or whatever, had largely been overturned by this new kind of managerial technocratic class. And that's really been the ruling class in developed countries since the mid 20th century. And as Swithun was pointing out, we've really seen this class show its hand with this coronavirus thing, because Swithun is exactly right. That this is who is running the show now. As Swithun was pointing out, what did these supposed right-wing authoritarian strongmen like Trump and Johnson and these guys do in response to coronavirus? But they really didn't want to do much at all. It's been these technocrats who've come out and say, we've got to lock everything down, we've got to quarantine everybody, we've got to shut down commerce and close the schools and all these kinds of things. And you see this happening as much on the local level as from the U.S. federal government or the British national government. I know here in the States, the states and localities have often been much more aggressive about these kinds of things than the federal government has so far. I really see that this is a situation right now where this technocratic managerial elite is showing its hand and is posing its own agenda based on its own value system, the kind of scientism and all of that Swithun was discussing, as well as this managerial class really exists throughout institutions. It exists within the state, it exists within science and medicine and all that, but it also exists within the banking system, within the corporate system. So here you have the corporations and banks, once again, just like 2008, saying, oh yeah, we've got a crisis, by the way, give us a few $1 trillion. And maybe throw a few crumbs to the peasants while you're at it, so they don't get too upset and come at us with pitchforks or something. And so that right there, I think, is really what defines much of modern Western political economy. Certainly in the States, from what I can tell, it's similar in Europe and somewhat similar in other whatever industrial democracies or whatever we want to call them. And that is the rule of this managerial class, motivated by the kind of value system that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I'll ask you the same question, Swithun. Do you think that the oligarchs coming out is going to be, to run in elections is going to be normative, or is it just a fluke?
I think it's difficult to say. It'd be interesting to see if anyone tries it the next time round for the Democrats, or interestingly, who'd replace Trump as the Republican candidate for 2024. Because traditionally what you would expect is the public not to like the billionaire candidate, because it's an obvious show of massive wealth relative to the average standard of living, and as Keith has pointed out, the widening income inequality, wealth inequality, etc. So you think that would be quite unpopular. Now, I didn't follow the Democratic primaries too closely to see how popular Bloomberg actually was. Obviously, he dropped out. But he didn't seem to have an entirely insignificant following. So the question is why these candidates now, and whether they could work in the future. I suppose you could say it's not necessarily they're flexing their muscles, but more that the oligarch class feels like they're so powerful now that they can even run openly as opposed to run things from behind the scenes. I suppose that's possible. But I am generally of the view that I don't really think it will probably make a huge amount of difference unless you somehow get vast amounts of power sent, much more than we even currently have, say, in the presidency or something else, to make a huge amount of difference. But again, given the current sort of bureaucratic nature of the states in industrialized countries, it's almost impossible for any one single leader just to direct the whole operation by his will. I mean, you may be able to do that in relatively undeveloped countries, just because the bureaucracy is significantly less sophisticated. But even if you did, I mean, at least how much cultural influence sort of the technocratic elites have, I don't really think it would make a huge amount of difference, even if George Soros, obviously he can't stand for American presidency because he was born in Hungary, I think, or he was born in Germany. I don't remember. He obviously couldn't stand, but even if he did, I mean, I suppose it's a ballsy move in one respect, but ultimately, would it really increase his influence? Well, if anything, it might decrease it because he can't work from behind the scenes. Because my general view is in many cases, the people who are the most powerful don't tend to want to be front and center because it's obvious what they're doing. So even if it does become normative, I suppose if it's a bit more show pony billionaire, I suppose they might, but I don't necessarily. I suppose it's 50-50. I'm not sure as to whether it would become normative in forthcoming years, but I could be wrong. I've got no strong view either way on it.
Okay, right. Ruminations. Same question. What are your thoughts?
I think that with respect to these billionaire candidates, I mean, are they really billionaire candidates in any special way that what doesn't already apply to the existing array of electable would-be officials or officials? I mean, maybe people who have won in the past have not been personal billionaires, all of them, but they certainly have the support of billionaires. And so I suppose when it comes to these populists, I mean, it takes someone in order to beat all of these super PACs and all of this sort of wealthy attention that's behind the normal political class. It seems to me logical that it takes a billionaire to win against a billionaire, but I don't really see it as a move in the direction of buying elections. If anything, it would be a move in the opposite direction. So, for example, something that is pointed out often by leftists in social science, is that you can kind of follow maybe where, and Noam Chomsky likes to point this out, the elections will land by following the funding. But it doesn't seem to be the case with Trump. And actually, there was a rather amusing, if very frustrating, interview that I saw with Chomsky, where he was asked, is this conclusion that you've drawn about spending being an infallible predictor of election outcome, does that withstand the example of Trump? And Chomsky gave some kind of answer about the wealthy in America shifting their funding toward Donald Trump at the last minute, and this is what led to the election of Hillary Clinton, which is, I think, a silly answer, because what I would like to have asked Chomsky in that instance is, well, imagine if the opposite result happened, if everything else remained the same, but it was Hillary who won over Trump, but the numbers were the same. Would he be scratching his head and saying, now, how did she win that, given that all of those funds switched at the last minute? Well, no, of course, he'd be looking at it and saying, well, obviously she outspent him, and that's why she won. But she didn't. She lost despite outspending him. So I think that actually it may be the other way around, and we actually, as things become more maybe visceral for the population, that it may be that it could become more difficult to simply outspend people as a means of winning elections, because I think that while you still will need, say, billionaires, people with funds, like people who are maybe analogous to the Gracchi brothers in certain senses, to able to have enough clout in order to displace the big spenders, it may no longer be the case that an opposition necessarily has to spend more in absolute terms in order to win an election. I think that this will become more the case as things go in this direction that Keith has pointed out, where America is kind of getting much more of a second world vibe. I think, like Bernie Sanders, for example, did not end up being as successful as he might have been in his move to get the Democratic nomination, but he did better than last time. And I was kind of imagining what it would look like to have Trump and Bernie Sanders up on the debate stage. That looks like something from South America. Like, that's very, it just in terms of like the culture, just the kind of feeling of it, I think. And you look at the sort of direction that celebrities are going in. I mean, I think that it's definitely a different mood that struck America that it looks like we've hit going into the 2020s. And I think that a part of this is that it's going to be a different quantity of politics. Like, yes, you'll still have oligarchs and they'll still be dependent on money. But I wonder if perhaps spending will not be quite as much of a determinant when it's cross-referenced with other considerations like appeal to various populist grievances and such. And I think that the change in the culture is reflective of the fact that we may actually be moving away from the kind of oligarchy that we've known, the sort of technocratic oligarchy, towards something that is just as oligarchic, but perhaps more visceral.
Okay. One interesting thing, at least with regards to the U.S. Conditions, is the state of the Democratic Party. What state is it exactly in? The primaries haven't been allowed to finish. We're not even sure if there'll be an election in November, because the Democrats haven't even chosen a frontrunner yet. But the sort of internal civil war, even before coronavirus shut this all down, between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden and the sort of establishment insurgent. I mean, is there even a Democratic Party anymore? And is there even going to be a two-party system anymore? So I'll give that to you, Swithun, first.
That's certainly an interesting question. Whether Biden actually does grab the nomination for the Democrats, the question is, where do all the more radical social democratic types go? The squad, as it were elected on a much more sort of culturally and economically leftist platform. for Congress, and they have a lot of, well, they have vocal supporters. Whether they have a lot of supporters is another question. But there'll certainly be some very disenfranchised Democratic Party sort of members who have seen Bernie stitch up probably 2 years, twice in 8 years. Well, really 4 actually. So do they have a big enough client base to really be a third party? I think they might, but I don't think they'll go anywhere particularly. They'll be very vocal, and they'll have lots of support on Twitter and on sort of the internet to some extent. But I don't really think they would go anywhere. I mean, they'd probably poll more than the Libertarian Party would. But I think if it were to split and the sort of corporate elite were to win out, they are clearly a far more broadly electable group than the more radical Bernie fringe, at least in general they would be. Unless, of course, the fringe turns more to economic issues rather than cultural ones. But given the way things have gone in the Democratic Party, I simply don't see that taking place. A more populist economic leftist one could do quite well, but they would then tie it in with anti anything that reeks of anything other than completely and utterly flat egalitarian society with gender, etc., etc. So if they were to do that well, and then you'd have a runoff really between the upper middle class technocratic elite with Biden and a more of a quasi-populist Republican Party. So yes, I suppose the left Democrats could sort of oust the Libertarian Party as a third party. It was a major third party, and they would get some more votes, but I'd still think you would likely have two vastly larger parties than all the others. Although the interesting question then is what happens post-Trump to the Republicans and whether they split, because that doesn't seem likely at the moment, but interesting to see when he goes, what happens to the Republican Party. Does the sort of traditional, well, quasi-traditional sort of neocons in the party try to come to the fore again? Or is it sort of left to a more populist party? If they actually end up staying with more of a populist agenda, you could eventually see some Republican sort of switching over to the Democrats if the Democrats are just sort of this neoliberal party. So splitting the Republican Party would be potentially interesting, but I think broadly speaking, the general locus of policy probably wouldn't change by a huge amount, at least not in the short term.
Okay, Ruminations, your thoughts?
Yeah, I hear these predictions about the Democratic Party going in two directions. I mean, on the one hand, you have sort of people on the dissident right who seem to be almost enthusiastically projecting a complete takeover by the Democratic Party of America because of change in demographics and because of Trump's inadequate performance as a populist or a nationalist. And then on the other hand, you have people who maybe are not that dissimilar in their views saying the opposite, that it's actually the Democratic Party is done because they're behaving so foolishly. They are, I suppose, so aggravating the traditional support base of kind of, say, lower middle class white people and so forth. So that there's this kind of divergence of opinion. Are they poised for some kind of takeover, or are they on the verge of completely collapsing? And what I think is that it's probably somewhere in the middle. And the reason I think that is because it is true that there is the fact that there is a change in the demographic situation, and it seems that the Democrats have situated themselves to have a kind of support base that will support them regardless of how foolishly they act. But on the other hand, I don't think that this at all that this kind of slogan you see on the dissident right of demographics is destiny. I don't buy that. The reason I don't buy it is because demographics is destiny plus a bunch of other stuff, and it's kind of a naive statistical interpretation to think that, well, just because they are going, their support is increasing demographically by a certain metric, that is going to continue forever. There are some very good reasons why it won't. As the Democrats, like if you look at how they're behaving with respect to identity politics and the fact that they then have this Joe Biden, who seems like he's going to be their nominee, who has just become totally, it really is, I'll just come out and say it. They've basically taken a man who's basically descending into senility, and they're propping him up there like a dead body. And, he can, sometimes it seems like he's on the verge of being barely able to speak. And as they are aggravating with respect to these demographic contentions, I mean, first of all, there's no reason to think that in their desperation that middle-class white people won't simply basically convert to the Republican Party even more so than they have been, simply because the Democratic Party becomes more and more identified as that which is hostile to them and that which they are not. In other words, it doesn't matter how ineffective or weak Trump is. If they see a Democratic Party that's going in the direction of, say, Ocasio-Cortez, and is engaging in all this other bizarre behavior, there's no reason to think that they won't take sort of half-hearted populism as a kind of least bad alternative. The other thing I would say is that one of the mistakes that the dissident right makes is kind of psychologically dividing the world into white people and non-white people. But this, of course, assumes that all non-white people see themselves as this kind of just amorphous block. And the reason is that they can do that presently is because whites are still a majority. However, I think that as in the future, when non-whites become a majority, at least on net, I think this will lead to minorities realizing that they have grievances with one another, and realizing that maybe siding with the traditional native population in terms of voting may be a strategically valid decision. So, for example, if faced with something like a mass growth of Islam, it's not at all impossible to imagine, say, Orthodox Jews or Black people starting to vote more rightward. I'm not saying that they will, but the point is that the current direction of demographic voter behavior is something that's contingent on certain circumstances. And I think that as circumstances change, those demographic voting tendencies may very well change. So what I imagine is that the Democrats will become more and more pandering to various outgroups, and they will become more and more bizarre in their behavior, and it will come to matter less and less. And the Republicans will come to be seen as the reaction to that. And this will lead not only, I think, white people to be more likely to become Republican, but it will also lead various other minorities to strategically vote Republican at some point in the future. So I see the Democratic Party surviving, though not dominating. What I see happening is the Republicans and Democrats becoming further polarized, being, well, more second world and more radical in their behavior, as almost kind of serving as outposts of two separate countries.
All right, Keith, your thoughts?
Yeah, I've been thinking about these questions for quite some time. And I remember back in 2003, I wrote a couple of articles, and those articles or essays are still on the attackthesystem.com website. But I remember at the time, this was back when the Iraq War was beginning and heating up. And it was during the, a couple years past 9/11, and it was when all the George W. Bush and the neocons and all that were in the ascendancy. And I wrote this article, or a couple of articles, where I said that, well, in the future of American politics, the real divide is going to be not with these neocons. They're going to be sort of a flash in the pan. Instead, the real conflict is going to be between the neoliberals and what the right calls some on the right call the cultural Marxists, or the SJW left and stuff like that. And at the time, I had some people ask me, well, heck, but they said, well, that's crazy. I mean, look at what the neocons are doing. They're waging war with multiple countries, and they're looting the economy, and class divisions are widening, and all these other things are happening. And I remember thinking at the time, well, yeah, but that's the problem with them, is that they're expending all of their political capital. The neocons were so extreme that they pretty much, sank their own boat. And that's exactly what happened in 2008 when the Obama era came in as sort of a backlash against the Bush era. That sort of, that was sort of a public repudiation of the neocons and their agenda. And I remember thinking way back in the early 2000s that that on one hand, economically, neoliberalism was very much on the rise, and then the cultural left was also very much on the rise, and that those two forces would eventually clash. And I also remember thinking that as far as the Republicans in the United States, to remain a competitive political party, they would have to reinvent themselves somewhat. Where the 1980s paradigm, the Reagan paradigm of, we're the party of fiscal conservatism and low taxes and business deregulation and hawkish foreign policy and social conservatism, I thought that would no longer be a sellable product eventually, because of the fact that the demographic base of the Republicans was shrinking. And even now, if you look at who votes for the Republicans, it's mostly middle-aged to older white people, primarily in the South and in the Midwest, and some suburban areas, depending on the location. And other than that, the Republicans don't really have a constituency. And as that constituency shrinks in size or dies off, they're going to be out of a constituency. They're going to have to find constituents from somewhere else. Now, I also thought that as the traditional working to middle class WASPs in the United States that were really the dominant culture for the history of the United States, as they started to lose power and shrink in size, that they would also go on the defensive and become more militant and more hardline in their politics, and that would give rise to a kind of right-wing populism of some kind. And that's happened as well. All the things that I was talking about back in the early 2000s have more or less happened, in the sense that in the Democratic Party, we've seen this big split between neoliberals, the Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer neoliberals, and the Social Democrats and the social justice warriors, the Bernie Sanders and Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We've seen that split happen. And then on the Republican side, we have seen the populist right come along and sort of eclipse the neocons. I mean, that's one of the things that I liked about Trump, was he actually torpedoed the neocons. He sunk their boat. He pretty much pushed Bill Kristol off the ship. And whatever else could be said about Trump, we can all thank him for that. But that's where we are now. The Republicans have more or less, at least rhetorically, I would emphasize rhetorically, because they still govern like neoliberals for the most part. But rhetorically, the Republicans have sort of shifted to this kind of populist right outlook that's somewhat similar to what you find among some of the populist nationalist parties in Europe. If you look at all the different ones that you have in Europe, and there are a lot of differences between those parties. But if you look at the Front National and UKIP and Brexit and AFD and Jobbik and many others with all their different variations, you see the Republicans have rhetorically moved in that direction with Trumpism, and you see that they have sort of push the neocons to the background along the way. And then you've seen this big split happen between the neoliberals and the social democrats and progressives on the Democratic side. Now, the big question is, how is that going to affect the alignment of the parties? Is one of the parties going to go away? Is there going to be a third party that comes along? Are the parties going to split up into multiple parties, or some Democrats going to leave and become Republicans and vice versa? I think that's a little harder to predict. But I tend to think that probably there's not going to be a competitive third party that comes along to replace either one of the other two, or compete with the other two, because the system is so stacked against that in the U.S. We've had this two-party system since roughly 1800. And I don't really see that changing. But I do think that what will happen is, one thing too we have to consider is that with the two parties, in many ways in America, could almost be understood as coalitions of parties. Like in most parliamentary states, you have multiple parties, and then you have a center-right party and a center-left party, and then a validly neoliberal party and a social democratic party, and then a populist nationalist party and a green party and a communist party and a religious party. And we kind of have all that, only it's submerged under the Democratic and Republican coalitions. So with the Democrats, I think we're going to continue to see this uneasy coalition of neoliberals and social democrats and social justice warriors and progressives, who, even though they hate each other's guts, they're still going to unite against the Republicans. And we actually see this happening with the current election. I mean, we saw the Democrats roll out a whole busload of candidates, including people that had some far-reaching differences with each other. But now that this dementia patient, the Captain Pike of the Democratic Party, it looks like he secured the nomination. Everybody in the Democratic Party, the furthest left ones, are all lining up behind him. Tulsi Gabbard gave him her endorsement. Andrew Yang. I'm sure Bernie's going to come around and give his friend Joe his endorsement eventually. So they're all lining up behind the person who's going to be the leader. And on the Republican side, we've seen the same thing happen. In the 2016-11, we had 17 candidates or whatever it was. A neoliberal candidate, a libertarian candidate, a neocon candidate, and all the others. And they all talked about what an awful guy Donald Trump was until he became the nominee, and then they all had to back up behind him. So I think that's going to continue to happen. The Republicans are going to continue to be this uneasy coalition of warmed over Reaganites and populist right wingers and resentful neocons who regret being eclipsed, and right libertarians. Although I do think, though, that the big question for the Republicans is how are they going to remain competitive given the demographic realities? And I think there's two ways they can go about it, or might try to go about it. One is to be a right-wing populist party, to say we are the nationalist populist, anti-immigration, socially conservative. We are the Jobbik, or we are the whatever of the United States. I think that getting the numbers they need would be problematic increasingly in the future. But another way they could go would be to become more populist on economic issues, to move away from the more neoliberal sounding or less Reaganite sounding stuff, and become almost like Christian Democrats or something like that, in the sense of, we're conservative, we're nationalists, we're populists, we're yada yada. We're not against the little people or anything like that. And we already see that. We already see Tucker Carlson and people like that, coming out. Like Tucker Carlson sounds almost like Noam Chomsky at times when he's denouncing the corporations and the bankers and and saying, well, materialist, consumerist culture is not everything. There's other values too. I could see them incorporating a substantial sector of that into their own coalition. And another issue is something similar, I think, to what Right Ruminations was saying, in that demographically, I see the potential, and I guess a lot of the movement conservatives and neocons will be happy to hear this, but I do see a potential for some minorities to move towards the Republicans for various reasons. In fact, we're already seeing a little bit of evidence of that. But I think, though, that is, like I know Michael Lind, whom I don't like in certain ways, but I think he's a fairly perceptive analyst of certain things. Michael Lind argued a while back that, on one hand, the working to middle class whites in the United States are in a state of decline. But that's not necessarily true for the minorities, that a lot of minorities, blacks and Hispanics and Asians, are actually doing better than they did historically in American society. Maybe not every sector, maybe not every class layer, but a whole lot of them are. Working to middle class blacks may be doing better than they were in certain certain times in the past. But the thing is, the more upwardly mobile some of the minorities become, the more of them own businesses, the more of them have higher professional class incomes, the more that conservative they may become on some economic factors. Also, if you look at the cultural views and social views of all the different Democratic Party constituent groups, African Americans tend to be the most conservative on every issue except race, obviously, but they often are the most anti-abortion, the most anti-gay rights, the most religious, for example. So I could also see that happening. I could see the Republicans sort of reinventing themselves as this uneasy coalition between neoliberals and Reaganites and right-wing populist nationalists and kind of Christian Democrat like economic reformers and socially and fiscally conservative minorities. And at the same time that the Democrats will still be this uneasy coalition of social democrats and social justice warriors from the left and neoliberals from the right. And I think that so you'll really have the equivalent of multiple two coalitions that are really just coalitions of parties, if not literally, at least in a de facto sense. And even though they all dislike each other, they'll be able to put together enough of a coalition that they can compete as a group through recognizing some common enemy or some common need for party unity. I think the Democrats are actually better at that than the Republicans. I was watching a commentator this morning on some talk show talking about this, and I think he was right. And he was saying, how is it that all of the far left people in Congress lined up behind this bill right after they denounced it? This stimulus bill. The Congress voted for this, trillions of dollars in giveaways to the corporate class. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and all these people come out and denounce it, and then they turn around and vote for it. And he was saying that's because the Democratic Party ultimately know how to impose discipline on their own members. Anybody in their party that ultimately defies the party on that level will become a total outcast, which is kind of what's happened to Tulsi Gabbard. And even she has turned around and endorsed Joe Biden. And the Republicans tend to be a little bit more haphazard, I think, in their organization at this time. So I think that that's one thing that separates them. So in a nutshell, that's how I kind of see the party system breaking down in the future.
All right. Now we're nearing the end of the discussion. Time for closing statements. I'll give you the first stab, Swithun.
So I think that I think we're unlikely to be in a similar situation to the end of the Roman Republic for reasons that have been mentioned so far. As to the future, I think Keith's analysis of how the party systems will work going forward is likely to be true. In first past the post systems, you effectively do get coalitions. They're just coalitions within parties rather than between parties, which you get in proportional representation systems. So ultimately, in reality, it might make some difference, but it doesn't make that as much difference as you might think. I see for the medium future a continuation of an increasingly authoritarian technocratic class who eventually may be overthrown, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. That'd be my overall series.
Right, Rumination.
Since I think I've given my thoughts on the analogy with the fall of the Roman Republic, I'll use my closing statement to just address this final thought about the nature of the two parties and where they're going to go. I think that it's possible to reconcile Keith's position with Swithun's and with my own. I mean, I think it lies in between all of those, in that I think that on the one hand, I mean, having all this conflict between different minority groups and having, I guess, more agitation in the population, more polarized politics is an opportunity for the technocracy to increase its efforts in terms of, say, the pursuit of things like hate speech laws, or the ability to quarantine people, for example, or to regulate certain aspects of the internet, just virtually any aspect of what they want to do. But at the same time, I think in order to pursue that, they have to, in order to facilitate that amount of conflict, there has to be a situation where there is given rise to different voices that are in conflict with one. Represents black interests, one that represents, interests that are opposed to immigration and so forth. So I think that it's possible for the elite to further consolidate their regulation of everyday life, while at the same time there is still a greater diversity and maybe tension between factional politics. I think that those things may work hand in hand, and I think that a large part of the conflict that may be embodied in a more radicalized Democratic, a more radicalized Republican Party may be the catalyst that allows the elites to pursue certain policies that might amount more to police state types of endeavor. So if you look at Singapore, for example, is a situation where, yes, there is a kind of divergence or diversity or tension, but to negotiate this is a rather intense supervisory power. And so I think that things will become simultaneously more chaotic, but with also opportunities for further imposition of elitist ideals. So I don't think that the neoliberal class is going to go away. I think that it's going to become less visible and less explicitly stated in terms of electoral politics. In other words, I think that it's going to be both a threat to and the pursuit of further technocratic neoliberal policies, that you have this tension between competing types of populism. And just to emphasize the fact that the observation that was brought up earlier, that configuration is completely second world and sort of characteristic of South American political configuration. So I think that if a third party does arise, it will probably be a neoliberal party. So like in some European countries, you'll have maybe a socialist party, a neoliberal party, and then a nationalist party, something like that. But that radicalization is something that I think will be taken advantage of by neoliberal technocrats or globalists, as they're kind of colloquially called, who will use that situation to basically look for opportunities to supervise the conflict or to minimize it through the pursuit of additional state powers. So I think that there are just a number of directions that things are going in, and I think it's possible to go in more than one direction at once. So if you'll excuse the clutter, that is sort of the thrust of my understanding of where America will be headed in, say, the next decade.
All right, Keith Preston.
Yes, I think that in the future, American politics will sort of look like a hybrid of Latin American politics and European politics, in the sense that Ruminations just mentioned the possibility of a neoliberal party in competition with a socialist and a populist nationalist party. Well, we already sort of have that in the U.S. On a de facto level. We have our neoliberal party. It has two factions, the moderate Republicans and the moderate Democrats. And then we have our socialist party, the left wing of the Democratic Party, and we have our populist nationalist party, the right wing of the Republican Party. So we have all that in practice, if not in name. It's just structured differently because of the historical differences and different structures of the state and that kind of stuff. Also, I absolutely agree that this technocratic managerial class is going to try to tighten its fangs, sink its fangs in deeper and tighten its grip over time. And I think Europe is a prototype for that as well, because in the individual European states, for example, you have the neoliberals and the populist nationalists and the socialists and all that. But overarching all of this is this technocratic class that controls the European Union and the transnational institutions, and increasingly that's where the real power, not to mention the international banks and all that. So that's where the real power lies, with the political class, being somewhat subordinate. And also, so that's the European side of the future of the U.S. politics. And I think the Latin American side, is also similar to what was being described before, and that is the norm in Latin America is you do have plenty of oligarchs, plenty of super rich people. You do have right-wing populists. You do have liberals who are just essentially puppets for the international institutions like the IMF and all that. And then you have socialists and people further to the left, and you have plenty of demagogues saying they're going to do this and that and the other thing for the common people. And you have a lot of people who run for offices who are uncouth and ill-mannered and loudmouth and ill-behaved, sort of Donald Trump types or very rhetorically intense, Bernie Sanders types or whatever. I see that happening in the United States as well. And I think that another thing too is people in the United States talk about how polarized U.S. politics is, and it is. I mean, the research shows that there's more polarization between Democrats and Republicans than at any point since the late 19th century in the aftermath of the Civil War. But it could still be even more polarized because in some Latin American countries, African countries, East Asian countries, Eastern European countries even, they actually have fistfights in Parliament. You can go on YouTube and find videos of African parliamentarians throwing chairs at each other, and I've seen brawls in the Taiwanese parliament and all of that. So it could still get even more intense in terms of the polarization without actually threatening the state or anything like that. And I think we'll move more in that direction as well. I think that American politics will continue to become a lot more divisive, a lot more raucous, a lot more Latin American and third world like. And at the same time, I think we'll continue to see the managerial elite try to tighten its grip, and we'll see the factionalization playing out along party lines the way I just described.
All right. Thanks again, everybody, for coming on. This is Tyler Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.